Bread is political. Not because pundits say it is, but because when the price of basic food moves, governments fall. And right now, the United States is walking into a trade reality most Americans don't understand. Canada doesn't have to cut us off to squeeze us. It only has to redirect a small, critical slice of wheat that our mills depend on to make consistent flour. That's the kind of dependency that never shows up in patriotic speeches, but it shows up in your grocery receipt. Stay with me, because in a few minutes, I'm going to show you the part that sounds boring until you realize it's lethal. Wheat is not one thing. It's a precision input. And the American food system, its mills, its bakers, its industrial recipes, was built around Canadian blending. That is the quiet leverage nobody in Washington wanted to admit existed. Then I'm going to connect that to the bigger story. Why tariffs aimed at teaching Canada a lesson are accelerating Canada's diversification, shrinking America's leverage over time, and pushing inflation pressure into the one place voters notice immediately. Welcome back to the Dollar Watch. This channel is about the hidden economy, the plumbing behind the headlines. If you want to stay ahead of the next shock, subscribe, because this story isn't about wheat. It's about how fragile integrated systems become when politics turns trade into warfare. Now let's establish the first principle. In trade, there are two kinds of goods. There are discretionary goods. You can delay a new car. You can postpone a kitchen remodel. You can live without a new phone for another year. Then there are non-discretionary goods. Energy, medicine, food. You don't delay calories. You don't tell a population to wait patiently for bread while politicians argue about tariffs. That's why the country that feeds you is not the country you casually threaten. Because food supply chains don't respond like iPhones. Food supply chains respond like a pressure system. They look stable until the day they aren't, and when they break socially. Here's the twist that makes this story so uncomfortable for Americans. The United States is one of the largest wheat producers on Earth. In most years, American farmers produce on the order of tens of millions of metric tons. On paper, that looks like self-sufficiency. It invites complacency. It creates the illusion that imports don't matter. But paper doesn't bake bread. The real world is built on specifications, not national pride. Flour mills don't run on flags. They run on protein percentages, gluten strength, falling number, moisture content, ash, and consistent performance across thousands of batches. And this is where the entire conversation changes. Wheat is not a single commodity. It's a category with multiple classes and varieties. Hard red winter, hard red spring, soft red winter, durum, white wheat. Each class behaves differently in a mill. Each class performs differently in a bakery. Each class is suited to different end products. If you've never thought about this, that's normal. You weren't supposed to. Modern supply chains are designed to be invisible. The bread shows up. The pasta shows up. The system works. And the system works so smoothly that people assume it's automatic. It's not automatic, it's engineered. For decades, North American mills optimized around blending. A common approach in the industry is mixing higher protein spring wheat with lower protein winter wheat to produce flour with consistent baking performance. The spring wheat provides strength. The winter wheat provides volume and cost efficiency. You mix to spec. You hit the performance target. Now here's the part that matters. Canadian wheat, especially high-protein spring wheat grown across the prairie provinces, has characteristics that are difficult to replicate at the same scale inside the United States year after year, with the same consistency. That is not Canadian propaganda. It's agronomy, soil, climate, growing season, crop genetics, decades of breeding and farming practices. You can grow spring wheat in the US, and the US does. But the point is not, can you grow it? The point is whether the domestic system produces enough of the right quality, reliably enough, to replace Canadian imports without raising costs or degrading product consistency. And that brings us to the dependency that Washington doesn't like to say out loud. The United States imports wheat, not because America can't grow wheat, Because America imports specific types of wheat to meet specific industrial needs. The import volume can look small compared to total U.S. production, which is why it's politically easy to dismiss. But the importance of an input is not measured only by tonnage. It's measured by whether the system can substitute it quickly. In complex systems, small inputs can be critical inputs. That's how shortages happen. Not because we ran out of wheat, but because we ran short of the exact wheat needed to keep certain flour streams consistent, and the substitution option either doesn't exist or is expensive. Now, if you're thinking, okay, so what? We could just adapt, you're partly right. Systems can adapt, but adaptation has a cost. And when it comes to food, the cost shows up as higher prices first, sometimes as quality changes, sometimes as reduced availability of specific products, and always as political anger. This is why trade disputes that touch food are always dangerous, even between friendly countries. They drag essential goods into negotiations that were never designed to be hostage situations. So what happened? The United States imposed tariffs on Canadian goods in a broader strategy of economic pressure. The stated goals have varied by dispute: market access, regulatory issues, political leverage points. The underlying assumption was consistent. Canada depends on the American market, therefore Canada will fold. That assumption is now being tested. And the results are not what Washington expected, because Canada's response, especially under Mark Carney's posture of diversification, has not been beg for exemptions. It has been reduce vulnerability. That difference matters. A country begging for exemptions is a country playing defense within your system. A country building alternatives is a country exiting your leverage. And once a country exits your leverage, you can't bully it back in. That's the part that turns a temporary tariff fight into permanent strategic damage. Now, I'm going to open a loop here that I'll close later because it's key for retention and key for understanding the real stakes. The wheat story is not isolated. Wheat is a case study in a larger North American dependency map. Potash for fertilizer, lumber for construction, heavy crude for refineries, intermediate manufactured inputs for autos and machinery. The pattern is the same. Washington assumes it has unilateral leverage, but the dependency is bidirectional, and the system is integrated. The moment you weaponize the integration, you incentivize your partner to rewire, and rewiring is the end of leverage. We'll come back to that. First, let's stay on wheat and get brutally practical. What happens when tariffs increase the cost of imported wheat? Mills pay more. That's step one. Then mills pass some portion of that cost into flour prices. That's step two. Then bakeries and food manufacturers see input costs rise. That's step three. Then grocery stores and restaurants adjust pricing. That's step four. Then you see it on the shelf and you feel it. That's step five. Nobody prints a receipt line that says tariff, you just pay more. And because food is a high-frequency purchase, you notice fast. This is why tariffs are so politically toxic when they bleed into groceries. People may not track bond yields. They may not understand balance sheets, but they understand that bread is up, pasta is up, baked goods are up, and their wage didn't move. Now here's where the story gets darker. Even if import volumes are relatively small, pricing is set at the margin. If a specific flour stream becomes more expensive because the marginal blending input is tariffed or disrupted, prices can move more than you'd expect. This is one of the hardest things for non-commodity people to understand. In commodity markets, the marginal unit often sets the price. You don't need to disrupt 100% of supply to move price. You need to tighten the marginal availability of the required spec. That's why a trade action that seems small can be felt as big in a specific segment of the food system. Now let's talk about Canada's options, because this is where Washington's leverage fantasy collapses. Canada produces a huge surplus of wheat relative to its domestic consumption. Canada is structurally an export nation in grain. It has built infrastructure, elevators, rail lines, port capacity around moving wheat to global markets. Canadian wheat is not a boutique product only Americans want. It is a global product with global demand. And in recent years, Canada has been quietly strengthening its logistics optionality. The Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway, created through major rail consolidation, connects Canadian grain-producing regions deep into the U.S. and down into Mexico. That matters because it reduces friction to alternative markets and strengthens Canada's ability to redirect flows. If you make the American market unstable through tariffs, political threats, unpredictable policy, Canada can treat the U.S. less like a default buyer and more like just another buyer. That is the shift, and once that shift begins, it tends to accelerate. Why? Because trade relationships are built on reliability. Mills and buyers want predictable rules. Farmers and exporters want predictable demand. When a market becomes politically volatile, the rational response is to reduce exposure, even if the market is large. This is why Carney's language about diversification matters. He's signaling that Canada is no longer building its economic future around the assumption of stable American partnership. That is a regime change in Canadian strategy, and it has consequences for you, even if you never cross the border. Here's the first consequence. When Canadian wheat is redirected to other markets, Mexico, parts of Asia, North Africa, it doesn't disappear from the global system. It competes, and it often competes against American wheat exports. That means a policy intended to protect American farmers can actually intensify competitive pressure on American farmers abroad. Canada shifts flows away from U.S. mills, and then the same wheat shows up in export destinations where American producers were selling. That's not theory. That's how commodity competition works. So tariffs can hit you twice: higher costs for domestic processors and tougher competition for domestic exporters. Now let's talk about the psychology of this, because psychology is the hidden engine behind long-term shifts. For decades, Canada's economic posture was anchored to one assumption: access to the U.S. is stable, rules-based, predictable. When you break that assumption through tariff threats justified by dubious national security claims or through unpredictable enforcement, Canadian businesses don't just complain, they replan. They invest differently. They seek redundancy. They build alternative customer relationships. They sign contracts that don't depend on American political mood. And this is the part Washington keeps misunderstanding. Even if you later reverse the tariffs, you don't reverse the lesson. Once a partner learns that access can be revoked overnight, the memory becomes a permanent risk premium. It becomes a permanent incentive to diversify. Trust doesn't return quickly in trade, because trade is not dating. Trade is infrastructure and capital expenditure. Grain infrastructure decisions are not month to month. They're multi-year. Farmers decide what to plant based on expected demand, price signals, and contracts. Exporters build customer relationships that last years. Rail and port operators plan capacity and routes. Once those routes shift, they don't snap back easily. And wheat has another feature that makes substitution difficult: growing conditions. You can't magically recreate Saskatchewan's climate in Kansas. You can't instantly create the same protein profile at the same scale by just planting different seeds. Crop breeding, agronomy, and regional suitability are slow. There are biological constraints and time constraints, so American mills face limited options if Canadian supply becomes more expensive or less reliable. They can pay up and pass the cost along. They can attempt reformulation, changing blends, adjusting recipes, potentially affecting product consistency. Or they can accept that certain premium flour streams become more expensive and downstream products follow. None of these are catastrophic in the "we're starving" sense. That's not what I'm claiming. This is not famine fear-mongering. This is inflation mechanics. This is vulnerability exposure. This is the realization that an integrated partner has leverage in critical niches, and those niches matter politically because they touch everyday life. Now remember the open loop I set earlier. Wheat is not isolated. If you understand the wheat story, you can understand the wider North American dependency map. Potash is a perfect example. Potash is a critical fertilizer input. Canada is one of the world's major potash suppliers. Fertilizer costs impact crop yields and food prices. You can't bully your fertilizer supplier without consequences downstream. Lumber is another. Canadian softwood lumber has been a recurring trade conflict for decades. Lumber affects housing costs. Housing costs affect inflation and social stability. Trade friction in lumber shows up in the cost of living. Energy is another. Parts of the U.S. refining system were built around Canadian heavy crude. That's not ideology, it's refinery configuration. When you tax or disrupt that feedstock, the cost shows up at the pump. The pattern is consistent. The U.S. and Canada are not two separate economies that trade. They are one integrated production zone with a border running through it. When you weaponize the border, you don't just hurt the other side. You create systemic inefficiency, and then you pay for that inefficiency yourself. This is why the old trade war as strength narrative fails in integrated systems. Trade war logic assumes the other side has no alternatives and you have no vulnerabilities. North America is the opposite. Both sides have alternatives in some areas, and both sides have vulnerabilities in others. Now, here's where the broader strategic picture gets even more uncomfortable. Canada's diversification is not just economic, it is geopolitical hedging. If Canada concludes the United States is an unreliable partner, it will deepen ties elsewhere: Europe, Asia, new regional blocs. And every new tie reduces American leverage not only in trade, but in security alignment over time. The wheat story is the micro. The alliance story is the macro. If you treat your closest partner like an adversary, you create an independent partner, not a compliant one. And independent partners don't take orders. They negotiate. Now let's talk about the part the political class hates. Voters feel this directly. Food inflation isn't an abstract chart. It's a weekly experience. People don't check CPI methodology when they're looking at bread prices. They don't care whether inflation is transitory. They care whether their grocery bill is rising faster than their income. That's why weaponizing trade in essential goods is so dangerous. It doesn't just create economic damage, it creates political instability. And when instability rises, governments often respond by doubling down on blame. They blame foreign gouging. They blame corporate greed. They blame anyone except the policy lever they pulled. But industry groups, millers, and supply chain professionals usually tell the same story. Tariffs add costs. Costs flow downstream. End of mystery. Now, I want to close the loop on leverage, because this is the real lesson. Canada doesn't need to freeze American wheat supply. That would be dramatic and self-destructive. Canada doesn't need to attack America. Canada only needs to do something much more powerful. Redirect. Redirect shipments to stable markets. Sign long-term agreements elsewhere. Invest in logistics that reduce dependence. Build redundancy. That's how you weaken a larger partner's leverage without firing a shot. And that demonstration changes everything, because it reveals the truth Washington didn't want to admit. The dependency was never one-directional. The United States assumed Canada would always prioritize American market access above all else. That assumption is dying. Not because Canada hates America, because Canada is responding to American volatility. This is defensive adaptation. But defensive adaptation has offensive consequences for the United States. Higher costs in certain supply chains, more competition in export markets, reduced reliability in integrated production, and diminished influence in future negotiations. So, what should you watch next? If you want to understand where this goes, watch Canadian export allocation. Where does Canadian high-protein wheat go? How does that change year to year as trade friction persists? Watch milling and baking industry commentary, especially about blend costs and specification changes. If mills start openly discussing reformulation or passing through costs, that's your signal. Watch rail and port investment. Infrastructure reveals intent. If Canada continues strengthening routes to non-US markets, it's not posturing. It's rewriting the map. And watch politics. Because July 2026 and the broader trade framework review cycles matter. When trade agreements become unstable, businesses behave differently long before the legal documents change. Now here's the final takeaway, and I'm going to make it blunt. A country that feeds you, is not a country you should casually threaten. Not because you'll starve, because you'll pay. You'll pay in higher prices, reduced stability, and a slower, colder kind of loss. The loss of leverage as your partner builds a world where they no longer need you. Wheat is just the cleanest example because it's essential, it's technical, and it's quietly integrated. It's the kind of dependency that doesn't make headlines until it does. If you want the next briefing, subscribe. Because the wheat story is not the end, it's the template. And the template applies to everything North America built together: energy, fertilizer, lumber, autos, and the entire economic relationship that used to be called the world's most dependable border. That border is still there, but the assumptions that made it safe are breaking. And once assumptions break, costs rise, quietly, relentlessly, right where you live.